All right. So as we did last week, and as we will also do next week, we're gonna approach this question in three parts. So first, I want to be clear on what the impact of the expulsion of Spain in 1492 was. And then we'll ask the question, in what ways was this an abrupt turning point, but in what ways had the basic developments already begun before 1492? And then we'll have a better way of asking, of positing what would have happened if the expulsion had not taken place. Now, I'll just give you a little spoiler alert, a little teaser. This week, there is going to be at least one way in which things would have turned out very differently. I'm not going to tell you what it is, though. I'm looking at your handout. I sort of put it right there. So, but I'm not going to tell you which one it is. But it's okay. So first, the event we're talking about, I think it's an event that's familiar to most of us. In 1492, the Jewish community, the Jews of Spain were expelled by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. Yes, it's the same year that Columbus sailed, and yes, it's the same year that Muslims were expelled from Spain, that it was the unification of Spain on the Iberian Peninsula. All of those things happened in 1492. But the first thing we have to understand is this wasn't your typical expulsion edict of Jews. This was not the first time that Jews had been expelled, nor would it be the last time. Jews had already been expelled from France and from England, from some of the states of Central Europe, from parts of Italy. There had been other expulsion edicts before, but the first thing we have to be clear is there were none like this one, for two reasons. First of all, the Jewish community of Spain, in terms of its longevity and in terms of its vibrance culturally and economically and politically, it really was unprecedented. I would say prior to 20th century American Jewry, there had never been a diaspora Jewish community. Well, I would say prior to 20th century American Jewry, the Jews of Spain were the single greatest diaspora Jewish community in our history. They had been in Spain for at least 700 years, which is twice as long as Jews have been in America. But also what they had managed to do in Spain, the stability they had managed to achieve, the development of culture in so many ways. It really was a remarkable Jewish community. It was a Jewish community that had a very firm sense of Jewishness, but also was very much part of mainstream society, in the same way we are now. And so, it also was a community that, although, as we shall see, had begun a period of decline in the 1400s, was not expecting to be expelled. It was a community that imagined itself being there forever. They really didn't see any, they weren't really expecting it to happen. Even if conditions had gotten worse, they still were expecting to be there. And so, for that reason, that expulsion edict, that act of expulsion was much more difficult for Jews. It was the Jewish community that was greater than any other and wasn't supposed to end. It really came as a real shock. The other reason is that, in terms of the larger picture of Europe, the expulsion of Jews from Spain wasn't just the expulsion from one country, but it completed the expulsion of Jews from Western Europe. When Jews were expelled from Spain, there were no Jews in most of Europe. You had to go much further east to find Jewish communities. There was a kind of finality in that sense as well. Okay. So this was an event with a very deep impact. Now, let's talk about what this impact was. First, what the expulsion from Spain reflected a change in the mentality of Christians and Christendom. When we look back at the history of medieval Christendom, there was a point at which medieval Christian Europe was becoming more tolerant and more accepting of Jews. Now that's counterintuitive for us sometimes, because we have this kind of assumption that living in the Middle Ages for Jews, especially with Christians, was always bad, that Jews were always on the edge of some crisis or some adversity. Not exactly. There was a point, and Christian Spain really had epitomized that, where conditions for Jews were getting better. You know, the date we usually choose is probably until at some point in the 1200s, conditions for Jews in Christian Spain had actually gotten pretty good. You know, the event that really kind of measures the high point was in the year 1263. In 1263, in the city of Barcelona, which was one of the larger and more important Jewish communities in Spain, there was a public disputation, a Jewish-Christian disputation. And arguing on the Jewish side was the greatest Jewish scholar of that age, whose name was Nachmanides, the Ramban. And arguing on the Christian side was a young Christian scholar named Pablo Cristiani, who had been born Jewish. He had been Jewish since he was 20, and he had this solid Jewish education. There was a public disputation that was done in the presence of the king of Castile, who had convened it. And this wasn't the only Jewish Christian disputation, but what's unique about this one was typically when there would be a Jewish Christian disputation, like there had been one in Paris in 1240. Jews never won these. These usually turned out really badly for Jews. I mean, they were kind of fixed. There were rules of this public debate. The Jewish scholar was required to defend Judaism without despair. It was not only defend Judaism, but prove Judaism as good as Christianity without disparaging anything Christian. Not an easy thing, not your typical debate. And Jews usually did not win. But in Barcelona in 1263, in that situation, the king really wanted a fair fight. And while the Jews didn't win, they didn't lose either. It was a draw. It was an impossible situation, but it reflected not only a level of toleration of Jews, but it really reflected the greatness of the Jews of Spain and even the Jews of Christian Spain. But thereafter, there begins this period of decline. You know, and part of this period of decline for Jews is that Christian toleration of Jews began to diminish. They began to retreat for a variety of reasons. Now, the most immediate reason was that, well, let me explain it to you this way. Christian toleration of Jews, and this is not just in Spain, but in general, was really built as a balance of two things. Now, I'm going to tell you what these are, because this balance isn't only about toleration. The dynamics of this balance also is a way to explain expulsion as well. So, on the one hand, you have theological considerations on one side of this balance, and the other you have practical considerations, mainly economic. So on the theological side, you have Christians who believe all the standard Christian things about Jews. Jews are guilty of deicide, murdering Christ. Jews are the servants of the devil. Jews are the representatives of evil. Blood libels, desecration of the host, poisoning the wells. All of those things are part of that theological toolkit with which Christians would see Jews, and they were decidedly negative. And if that had been the only basis of Christians seeing Jews, well, things would have been much worse, and Jews wouldn't have been tolerated at all. There wouldn't have been what we would call not only physical space for Jews in the world of Christendom, but also cultural space or political space. The reason Jews were allowed not only to be there, but even to some extent to thrive, was because of the other side of the balance, which was more practical and especially economic in nature. Jews, they played a crucial role in the economies of Europe for a couple of reasons, and I'm going to make a very complicated story. I'm just going to distill it down to you in 2 or 3 sentences. First of all, Jews were really the only population that was taxable and had any assets that could be taxed. Nobles could not be taxed. The church could not be taxed. Really, the only people other than Jews who could be taxed in the Middle Ages were peasants. But if you tax peasants, they don't have any cash. All they have is either animals or labor. And if you're a king who needs money in the treasury, let's say, I don't know, to pay mercenaries to fight battles, you can't pay mercenaries in peasant labor. You need cash. Jews, because Jews were concentrated in the area of commerce and money lending, Jews had cash and they were taxable. They were an indispensable source of cash for royal and imperial treasuries. That is a very important practical consideration for keeping Jews around. Because the belief was, if you don't have Jews, you lose a substantial part of your liquid capital from taxes. Part of the revenue from Jews was also in the form of gifts, which meant Jews typically would bribe the king, the nobles, the officials. It was a regular thing. There would be regular points of the year where Jewish communities were just expected to hand over bribes. Jews were also deemed essential, indispensable to developing commerce and, of course, for providing credit. That's the balance. There were theological considerations saying we don't want Jews around, but there were these practical economic considerations which said we need the Jews around, and they existed in this delicate balance. Now, one of the vulnerabilities of Jews in this situation was if they became less economically necessary or useful, if I remember my economics correctly, if their economic utility diminished too far, then the balance would swing away from tolerating Jews. So I'll put it this way. There was no Jewish community that was ever expelled when they were at the height of their economic wealth. Jewish communities that were expelled were expelled following a period of economic decline in Spain and everywhere else. But that's the balance between theology and economic utility that really determined the status of Jews, how welcome Jews would be, and whether or not Jews are going to be expelled. Now, in Spain, we have a nice little twist. Well, I don't know how nice it was, but here's the twist in Spain. Because like I said, the path to expulsion of every Jewish community begins with an economic setback. So I'll just give you, Jews were expelled from England in 1290, but the road to expulsion began a century earlier when the Jewish community of York, which after London was the most economically important, was destroyed in a riot. After 1190, the Jewish community of England got poorer and poorer, and when they were finally expelled, they were just a shadow of what they were. So in Spain in 1391, there were a series of anti-Jewish riots, really provoked by Christian preachers in a number of towns, beginning in the town of Toledo, not to be confused with Toledo. There were a series of riots. A lot of Jewish communities were destroyed. And so subsequently, even though the Jewish communities of Spain were still, in absolute terms, the most prosperous anywhere in the world, in absolute terms, in relative terms, the Jewish community of Spain after 1391, and certainly by 1492, was economically only a shadow of what it had been previously. So the Jews of Spain in 1492 were still the greatest Jewish community in the world in 1492, but they were much less compared to the Jews of Spain a century earlier and 2 centuries earlier. So there is this beginning of the decline, and here's the twist. Typically when Jews would face this economic decline and the situation would worsen, Jews would begin to leave, and there were some Jews in Spain who left. But what we have in Spain after 1391 is a wave of Jews converting to Christianity. A lot of Jews in Spain converted as opposed to, let's say, leaving. Now, we don't know exactly how many. There's a lot of different estimates, but I think one of the more reliable estimates is that from 1391 until 1492, about 60,000 Jews converted. That's about a third of Spanish Jews. It's a big number. But it meant that in Spain during the 1400s, there was this growing population of Christians who, not so much in the past, had been Jews. And when these Jews would convert, they would change religion, but economically, they continued to do the same thing. Now remember to keep the balance in mind here. It meant that as the 1400s moved on, Jews in Spain, I mean like Jews who were not converted, they were seen as being less and less economically necessary because they were now Christians who were doing the same thing. There were Jews who had converted to Christianity who were engaged in commerce, living in towns, lending money and interest, which they were now allowed to do. So the economic utility of the Jews went down. And that happened long before 1492. So if the reason to keep Jews around was economic, well, that reason was diminishing because the sovereigns of Spain, they had this Christian community that met that need. But there was a problem. There was a problem from the theological side of that balance. Because increasingly during the 15th century, Christians in Spain, and especially the church in Spain, became increasingly suspicious of the authenticity of the Christianity of these Jewish converts. These Jews who converted to Christianity, the term for them was conversos. Converso simply means convert. But increasingly during the 1400s, especially as more and more Jews began to convert, the church began to think, wait a minute, I don't think all of these conversions were real or authentic. I think some of these Jews are just converting to avoid the persecution. They don't really believe any of this stuff. In other words, they're Christians, but they're not true believing Christians. And incidentally, that's a big problem for the church. See, it's one thing not to be a Christian. If you're not a Christian, your status is an infidel, an unbeliever. And okay, you're outside, but that's fine. But if you're a Christian who's not practicing properly, if you've been baptized and you're a backslider, that's not an infidel. In that case, you're a heretic. And for Christians, heretic is much worse than infidel. If you're an infidel, you just, you don't reap the benefits of the Christian afterlife. You don't get to be a Christian. If you're a Christian heretic, when you die, you burn in eternity you burn in hell for all eternity, which I imagine is a very long time and very uncomfortable. So the church and Christian society in Spain was not only wary and suspicious of these Jews who had converted to Christianity, this is going to sound odd, they were actually kind of worried about their eternal souls. They didn't want them dying in sin. And so there was this attempt to find the ones who were inauthentic, and get them to confess. And so we have the pursuit of what was eventually known as Marranos. Now, you've heard the term Marranos. Marranos is a term we don't like to use. Marrano is a very disparaging term. The Marrano this was the term used to refer to Jews who had converted to Christianity but were practicing Judaism in secret Jews or crypto Jews. But the term Marrano literally means pig. It's not a nice thing. It's like today the K word to describe Jews. I don't even like to say it anymore. It's a very negative term. So when they spoke about the problem of Marranos, they were talking about a certain phenomenon, but they were using a very nasty word. So I'm not going to use the word Marranos anymore. I'm going to use the word secret Jews or crypto Jews just because it's nicer. It's nicer. That's what I'm going to do. Okay? Now, the fact of the matter is, we don't know exactly how many of those Jews who converted to Christianity were secret Jews. Probably, most historians agree that maybe 20% at the most, probably less. Most Jews who became Christians simply became Christians. But the perception was the vast majority were. And here's where this story gets kind of interesting. Because these Jews, conversos, they weren't only seen differently. I mean, they were seen as not being quite Christian. So during the 1400s in Spain, Spain went from having Christians and Jews to having Christians, conversos, and Jews. Now, how did you know the difference between a converso and a Christian? The rule was, if you were a Christian, if you couldn't show that your family pedigree, that your Christian genealogy predated 1391, the year of the riots, you were defined as a converso and not as a Christian, which were not the same thing. To be considered a true Christian, you had to be able to show that your family had been Christian before 1391. So, other than this perception and this attitude, did it really matter whether you were a Christian or a converso in practical ways? For a long time, no. But in 1449, in the city of Toledo, the city council of Toledo passed something called Sentencia Estatuto. Look at your handout. Look at text number 1. This is a series of laws that aren't distinguishing Jews from Christians, that are distinguishing conversos from Christians. And remember, most conversos were simply Jews who had converted to Christianity, who thought of themselves as Christians. Okay? Look at let's read a little bit of this. Okay, this is text number 1. Quote, among the privileges and liberties granted by the kings to the city of Toledo is that given by King Alfonso of Castile of glorious memory, in which following the canon law, he orders and rules that no convert of Jewish lineage may possess or hold any office or benefice in the city of Toledo or its lands and jurisdiction, being suspect in their Christian faith. In other words, if you're a Christian and your Christian identity is under investigation, you are exempt, you are banned from holding public office. Now you got to imagine, it's one thing to say, okay, Jews are not allowed to hold public office. That we would understand because Jews were second-class citizens in Spain, but this is one group of Christians excluding another group of Christians. And then it elaborates a little bit. We, Pedro Sarmiento, royal governor and commander of the most noble and loyal city of Toledo, and all the counselors and officers, nobles and citizens of the people of the city, order and declare that inasmuch it is notorious by canon law as by civil law, that the conversos of Jewish lineage, being suspect in their Christian faith, which they frequently abuse and make light of by their Judaizing, come back to that word in a second, may hold neither public or private office, nor benefices in which they may do injury, harm, or abuses to old Christians of pure blood. Wow. Now, this notion Judaizing, this meant that there was a suspicion that Jews who were inauthentically Christian being Jewish in secret, weren't just being Jewish in secret. They were using the fact that they were part of Christian society to lure real old blood, pure Christians away. In other words, the crypto Jews went from being just a problem to being a threat. And part of the threat was, increasingly during the 1400s, the nature of the threat was, well, they're practicing Judaism in secret. Why are all these Jews who have become Christians practicing Judaism in secret? Is because the reason given is, yes, they've become Christian, but their social ties, their connections to Jews have not changed. The belief was, and this was often true, Jews who became Christians, they would continue to have the same connections with their family members who were still Jews, or their friends who were still Jews, or their business associates who were still Jews. They didn't separate themselves entirely from the Jewish community. And so the mentality increased and became more intense that as long as there are Jews, and I mean Jews, in Spain, The problem of the crypto-Jews would not only remain, but it was going to get worse. That the reason there are so many of these inauthentic Christians is because these Jews are still here. Now, so this is a remarkable moment, and this is something which is unprecedented. Incidentally, the term used to describe these laws, and it goes on, other disabilities as well. These conversos are going to be excluded. The term they used was limpieza di sangre, purity of blood laws. So this is the weird part about it. They didn't have the terminology or even the concept of race at this point, but many historians believe this is the first racial legislation, maybe in the history of the world. A situation where one group is going to be singled out from another simply because of its bloodline. That's what's happening to the conversos here. Now, the problem got bad enough that by the end of the 1400s, in 1479, the church set up a branch of the Papal Inquisition. Now, the original Inquisition, the branch is going to be called the Spanish Inquisition. The original Papal Inquisition was set up in the 1220s, and the original Papal Inquisition, you might know it, if you ever read the book The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, which takes place in France, there's a character named Bernard Gui. He's played by F. Murray Abraham in the movie. Maybe that's too long ago. Whatever. He was a papal inquisitor. The central goal, the purpose of the Papal Inquisition was to combat Christian heresy. The central function, the central task of the Spanish Inquisition was to combat converso heresy. Those two things are not the same. They're going after Christians who are heretics, but the Spanish Inquisition was tasked specifically with targeting Jews who had become Christians, who were suspicious, who were suspected of being unfaithful Christians, heretics, and secretly Jewish. And like I said, even though most conversos were not doing this, most conversos were suspected of doing this. If you want to think of McCarthy in the 1950s, that anyone who did or said anything irregular was automatically suspected of being a communist, that's this, except that it went on longer and the punishment was much more draconian. If you were arrested by the Inquisition, basically what they did was they arrested you, they tortured you until you confessed your sins so you wouldn't die in sin. You had to admit that you were a heretic, and then they killed you so you wouldn't die in sin. And they did all of that in the name of being merciful, because sometimes history is just full of irony. So yes, they thought they were being very merciful. The point being that before 1492, Spain was becoming a less and less habitable place for Jews because Christians were becoming more intense and fundamentally Christian, but also a less hospitable place for conversos. It was becoming a more and more difficult place for them to live. Okay? Now, as we approach 1492, we know what did happen was an expulsion. The question we have to ask, if the concern was, the fear was that the reason the converso problem exists is because there's too much contact between Jews and Christians, were there any alternatives to expulsion? Is there a way to solve that problem? You see what I'm saying? The concern is that good Christians have too much contact with Jews, and it's tainting them. For conversos, it's making them becoming crypto-Jews, and some even Christians are being lured to Judaism. And actually, it turns out in retrospect, there were two alternatives to expulsion. Let's call one the Portuguese alternative, and let's call one the Italian alternative. So the Portuguese alternative, in 1492, when Jews were expelled, a big chunk of Jews did what Jews often do when they're expelled from somewhere, is simply cross the border to the nearest country where Jews are still allowed. And in 1492, when Jews were expelled from Spain, they were still allowed in Portugal, so a lot of Jews just crossed the border into Portugal. And they lived in Portugal for 5 years, but in 1497, the King of Portugal, who had never wanted Jews there in the first place, and also felt that Jews were corrupting Portuguese Christians, in 1497 he ordered the forced conversion of all Jews in Portugal to Christianity. So the Portuguese alternative to expulsion was, instead of kicking the Jews out, well, just turn them into Christians. Problem solved. Except that he had not learned the lesson of the Spanish crypto-Jewish problem. Because those Jews who stayed in Portugal and became, they essentially became Portuguese conversos, and a lot of them, even more so than in Spain, continued to, their Christian identity was very weak because it had been coerced. But secondly, a lot more conversos in Portugal than in Spain became crypto-Jews. So the Portuguese alternative, forced conversion, terrible, did not work. All right? The Italian alternative, though, worked a little bit better. Because in Italy, the Church Catholics were also concerned about too much contact with Jews. But in Italy, they never really expelled Jews. There were local expulsions. Jews, there wasn't no one country called Italy. So Jews would be expelled from one part of Italy and then go to another. If you're expelled from Venice, you would go live in Florence. Or if you were expelled from Florence, you would go live in Milan or something like that. You could go from place to place. But what eventually happens in Italy as an alternative, the Italian Christians figured out a way to separate Jews from Christians without losing the economic benefit of Jews being there. And these, of course, were the ghettos, the Italian ghettos. So beginning in 1516 in Venice, Jews in Italy were required to live separate from the Christian population. So that satisfied that theological concern, but Jews continued to be part of the economy. As threading the needle goes, that was a pretty good way to do it. But it didn't change the fact that in Spain, either they didn't have the idea or they didn't think the idea was viable enough. They never tried it. In Spain, ultimately, the Jews were expelled. And you can see in the expulsion edict itself, the problem is laid out. The reason for the expulsion of Jews is spelled out very clearly. And remember, there is this balance between the theological and the economic. By 1492, Jews were economically less well off, partly because 60,000 Jews were not Jewish anymore, they were now Christian. The Jewish community in 1492, the communities were just a shadow of what they had been, and so that balance swung in the direction of theological concerns. Look at text number 2. Let me just read a little bit of what's known as the Alhambra decree. This is the expulsion of Jews from Spain. Okay, text number 2. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, same ones who sent Columbus, by the grace of God, King and Queen of Castile, Leon, Aragon, blah, 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 all the other places, and to all Jews and to all individuals of these places, and to barons and women of whatever they may be, and to all other persons of every law, state, and condition they be in. In other words, this is an open letter to everybody, okay? Salutations and grace. See, this first paragraph could have just said salutations and grace, but it's a royal edict, so it has to mention every single title and every single person, because that's, clearly they had nothing better to do. Okay, you know well, or ought to know, that whereas we have been informed that in these our kingdoms there were some wicked Christians, meaning conversos, who Judaized and apostatized from our holy Catholic faith, right out of those laws from Toledo in 1449, the great cause of which was interaction between Jews and these Christians in the courts which we held in the city of Toledo in the past year, let's skip a little bit. Next paragraph. Furthermore, we procured and gave orders that inquisition should be made in all our aforementioned kingships and lordships. In other words, we tried to solve this problem by using the Spanish Inquisition to basically eliminate this widespread heresy and the problem of Judaizing, but the Inquisition was unable to do it, and accordingly were informed by the inquisitors and by other devout persons, ecclesiastical and secular, that great injury has resulted and still results since Christians have engaged in and continue to engage in social interaction and communication, that they have had means and ways they can to subvert and to steal faithful Christians from our holy Catholic faith. In other words, Jews, and especially conversely, they're bringing Christians over. It has to be stopped, all right? What are they going to do about it? Skipping down to the next paragraph. Notwithstanding that we were informed of the great part of this before now, and we knew that the true remedy for all these injuries and inconveniences was to prohibit all interaction between the said Jews and Christians and banish them from our kingdom, we desire to content ourselves by commanding them to leave all cities, towns, and villages of Andalusia, where it appears that they have done the greatest injury. In other words, they thought maybe we'll do sort of a selective and limited expulsion, but the only real solution they came up with is Jews must be driven out entirely. That's the rationale behind it. They could have tried to forcibly convert all the Jews. They could have put the Jews into ghettos, like the Italians did. They chose to do it this way. Okay? And, well, I mean, at this point, the consequences for Jews, well, we can talk about the consequences for Jews and the consequences for Spain. The consequences for Spain was that there's this very interesting coincidence. From the moment, or right around the time that Spain expelled all these Jews, and remember, the expulsion wasn't only from Spain. If you look, or what we call Spain today, if you look at the front page of your handout, the Spanish Empire and the area where the expulsion was implemented wasn't only Spain. Everything red on that map, the bottom map, was Spain. Spain in 1492 included the Netherlands, included southern Italy, and then, of course, it eventually included the New World. Everywhere the Spanish flag was after 1492, Jews were expelled from these places. Moreover, wherever Spain went, a branch of the Spanish Inquisition was set up. So these places, there were people who simply Jews were not allowed, conversos didn't want to. They were difficult places to live. But what happens is, we look back on the history of Spain. If we were to chart Spain as a great power of Europe, Spain is going to reach a peak at some point, in the 1500s, not long after the expulsion. At some point, Spain is going to be the most powerful country in Europe. It's one of the reasons why Spain, along with Portugal, are the great explorers, because they're the richest countries in Europe and the most technically advanced countries in Europe and militarily the mightiest countries in Europe. But by the end of the 1500s, Spain is in rapid decline. Within a century or two, Spain is no longer going to be a great power. Spain is going to be superseded by Great Britain, by France, and by the Netherlands once they become independent of Spain. In fact, one of the reasons the Dutch are able to become independent is that they're going to kick the Spaniards out, and that's going to aid them becoming a commercial titan in Europe. So for us, the temptation is to say, well, let's look at it in the way some people saw it. Okay, there were thinkers subsequently, people who lived in the 1600s and the 1700s and the 1800s, who began to reflect on how expelling Jews from Spain, that connection between expelling Jews from Spain and the decline of Spain itself. Was there a connection? I'll give you a more blatant example. Look at text number 5. Text number 5, this is from a pamphlet that was written by an Englishman named John Toland in 1714. Now, I'll give you a little context. Toland in 1714, this pamphlet was called Reasons for Naturalizing the Jews of England. This is a point where Jews in England are still second-class citizens. They're now allowed to be there, but they're still second-class citizens. But Toland is saying, no, we should welcome Jews as citizens. And look at one of the reasons he's going to give. He's going to compare two places. He's going to compare the city of Lisbon, which is the capital of Portugal, but eventually, Spain and Portugal became one country in 1580 for a couple of centuries. So he's going to compare the city of Lisbon, where Jews were not allowed, where Jews were first forcibly converted, and later they came under the edict of expulsion. He's going to compare that city with a city on the coast of Italy called Livorno, which is also called Leghorn. Now, Livorno, at the end of the 1500s, which was in northern Italy, wasn't under Spain, was one of the first cities to basically say, not only are we not going to exclude Jews or exclude conversos, we're going to welcome them in. In 1593, the city of Livorno issued what was known as the Livornina. In fact, before we look at Toland, let's look at text number 4, this Livornina. With the city of Livorno, remember, this is a time where Spain is still the mightiest country in Europe, or at least it seems that way. And what does the Livornino say for the city of Livorno? We grant to all you Jewish, Turkish, Moorish, and other merchants real, free, and most ample safe conduct, as well as free faculty and license, that you may come, stay, traffic, pass through, and dwell, with or without your families, leave and return and trade in our city of Pisa and the territory of Leghorn. Jews are welcome to come in. So the same time when Spain has basically driven all the Jews out and scared away a lot of the conversos, in Livorno, they're actually welcoming Jews in. So Spain in 1593 is a place where there really are no Jews anymore, a handful of secret Jews, fewer and fewer conversos, whereas Livorno, there are more and more. So keep that in mind. Then, a century later, Toland writes this. He's making the argument that Jews should be welcomed and made full citizens, and he's going to contrast Leghorn/Livorno with Lisbon. Listen to the way he says it. This is text number 5. What a paltry fisher town was Leghorn, Livorno, before the admission of the Jews. What a loser is Lisbon, since they have been lost to it. In other words, this is Toland saying, and he's echoing a broad sentiment saying that expelling the Jews it doesn't only have an impact on Jews, it causes a country to decline, like Spain. And welcoming the Jews caused the city of Leghorn, Livorno, to be transformed from some insignificant little fishing town to a major commercial center on the Mediterranean, a major maritime center of commerce and trade. Wow. But here's the thing, that does sound great, and it is a nice boost for us, but no offense to Toland, what he didn't realize was this. It wasn't the expulsion of Jews per se, or it wasn't the absence of Jews in Spain that caused the decline, and the presence of Jews per se that caused the rise of Livorno as a maritime center, but the absence or the presence of Jews was a symptom of something larger. And what the larger pattern is that religious intolerance is bad for, maybe everything except religion. Maybe even religion. It's certainly bad for the economy. It's bad for politics. If you're driving away productive people simply because of who they are, then you're a loser like Lisbon. You decline. And if you're welcoming everybody, regardless of who they are, that works out well for you. So from the vantage point of the decline of Spain, probably even if they hadn't expelled the Jews, let's say Spain had Well, if they had forcibly converted the Jews, even if they had put the Jews into ghettos instead of expelling them, the decline probably would have happened anyway, because it was the religious intolerance that caused the decline. Every country in Europe that became a major power, certainly from the 1600s on, the driving force of that was the creation of what one sociologist called a religiously neutral society. Our term for that is the separation of religion and state. That worked out well that always worked out well for the economies of Europe. So for Spain, expelling the Jews, well, it worked out very badly. Even if they hadn't, probably the same thing wouldn't have happened. That religious intolerance, regardless of who they were intolerant of, was going to work out badly. Now, for Jews, both in Europe and in the Middle East and North Africa, the expulsion from Spain had another powerful impact. Following the expulsion from Spain, we have the emergence of what we might call the Sephardic diaspora. As Jews leave Spain, the place that Jews leaving Spain, they went temporarily to Portugal, but aside from that, the place where most Jews leaving Spain went was somewhere in the Muslim world. This is one of those things that's kind of counterintuitive to us in the 21st century. Until the year 1700, on the whole, it was better to be Jewish in a Muslim country than it was to be Jewish in a Christian country. Christian countries tended to be intolerant. Muslim countries tended to be more tolerant. Most Jews who fled Spain crossed the Mediterranean to Morocco, North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, what is today Turkey, or the Balkans, or somewhere else in the Middle East, and the land of Israel, which belonged to the Ottoman Turks. And something very interesting happened when Jews from Spain left, because typically when you have Jews fleeing from one place or migrating from one place to another, when Jews arrive in their new home, they adapt not only to the culture of their new home, but they become part of the indigenous Jewish community. They become more part of that community. But in this case, the opposite happened. Each time an enclave of Sephardic Jews arrived somewhere, the Jewish community in their new home became Sephardic. The Jews who were already there, within a generation, they became Sephardic. Historians call this the Sephardicization of Jewish life in the Middle East and North Africa and the Balkans. One of the reasons was because the culture that Jews from Spain brought was just so much more well-developed and vibrant than what Jews were doing anywhere else. And so they transform these communities. That's why today, for example, there are many Jews who come from Iraq are Sephardic Jews. Many Jews from Turkey are Sephardic Jews. Salonika, Thessaloniki, this was a Sephardic Jewish community. That's why you have many Sephardic Jews who live in Italy. The Jewish community of Sofia, Bulgaria, which belonged to the Turks until 1878, is largely Sephardic, because Jewish refugees from Spain came, settled, and transformed it. Now, here's an example where Jews were already leaving Spain even before 1492, and if the Jews had not been expelled in 1492, this process of Sephardicization, well, it wouldn't have happened as quickly. It was still going to happen, because there were Jews who were leaving Spain before the expulsion. They weren't only leaving because of the expulsion, they were leaving because the situation there was getting worse. For the last 100 years, it was getting more difficult, and wherever they went, they were still bringing Sephardic culture with them. So, for example, the spread of the Ladino language was going to go to other parts of the world, regardless of whether Jews in Spain had been expelled or not. We'd still have the Sephardic diaspora. Okay? Now, the one part of the Jewish world that was largely unaffected, the real example here was Polish Jews. The Jews of Poland were almost entirely unaffected by the expulsion of Jews from Spain. if Jews had been expelled or they hadn't been expelled, what happened with Polish Jews was going to happen exactly the same way. It was simply a place where Sephardic Jews didn't go. It was too far. There was no easy waterway to get there. You couldn't cross the Mediterranean to Poland. And I think for most Jews coming from Spain, Poland was just over the edge of the earth. It was just too far away. It was too remote. Not to mention that, well, Sephardic Jews, they saw themselves as the greatest Jews in the world. And in terms of different Jewish communities, well, I hate to tell you this if you're Ashkenazic, but really until the 20th century, Ashkenazi Jews were kind of the low Jewish community on the totem pole. We were the upstarts in Jewish history, and every other kind of Jew looked down their nose at Ashkenazic Jews. I know. It changed in the 20th century, but that's simply what it was. Okay. Now, like I said, there was one way in which the expulsion did have a profound impact and which things would have been very different. And this has to do with the impact of the expulsion on not so much the Jewish belief in the Messiah, but with the Jewish preoccupation with the Mashiach and the Messianic age. So what I'm going to tell you is what what Jewish historians call the Sholem thesis, in reference to a 20th century historian whose name was Gershom Scholem. Gershom Scholem was a German Jew who made Aliyah in the 1920s. He was one of the founders of the Hebrew University. He was the first academic scholar of Kabbalah. He wasn't the first Kabbalistic scholar, but he was the first to study Kabbalah as an academic discipline. He invented this area of Jewish studies, and he also was really the real expert on the Jewish concept of the Mashiach. In studying Kabbalah and studying the Jewish belief in the Mashiach, he posited the following. Well, he posited the following connection between the way Jews understood the Messianic age and Kabbalah. This is what he said. Until 1492, until the expulsion from Spain, Scholem suggested, the focus in the study of Kabbalah, it was more restorative, by which I meant Kabbalists would start with the premise that the world, when it was created, was perfect. Gan Eden was perfect. Subsequently, it became imperfect, and the goal of Kabbalah, of Kabbalistic study, of Kabbalistic contemplation, of mystical rituals, improving the world, in other words, the goal was to restore the world to its perfection at the time of creation. In other words, Scholem said that until 1492, Kabbalah was more, I don't want to say backward looking because it wasn't primitive, but it was oriented toward the past. That's a better way to say it. After 1492, partly because the intensely traumatic and cataclysmic nature of the expulsion from Spain, there was this surge of Jewish expectations about the Mashiach. One of the Jewish beliefs about the Mashiach is that the Messianic age is going to be preceded by some great cataclysmic event, and there were Jews who were expelled from Spain who believed that expulsion was the event, was the cataclysmic event that would lead and usher in the Messianic age. You follow me? Because it was such an impactful moment. It was so powerful. It was so dramatic. It had to be. And so, after 1492, there were more and more Jews, and I'm not saying there was most Jews, but it went from close to zero to Jewish intellectuals and thinkers and others who began to really, in a very serious way, think that the Messianic age, the arrival of the Mashiach, was sooner rather than later. And, for example, in some ways, this presented itself in more concrete ways. The last great Jewish scholar in Spain before the expulsion was Isaac Abravanel, Don Isaac Abravanel, the last of the great Jewish scholars. After 1492, now in addition to being a Talmudic scholar and a philosopher and a halachist, he was a mystical scholar. He actually made a prediction that the Mashiach would arrive within 20 years after 1492. He really believed that the Messianic age was nigh. It was arriving imminently. In the early 1500s, there were two individuals, both of whom were from families of refugees from Spain. One named David Reuveni, one named Shlomo Molcho, who claimed to be the Mashiach. They thought they were the realization of that. So it manifested in a number of different ways. But Sholem said, probably the most important way in which this growing preoccupation with the Mashiach manifested itself was a shift in the study of Kabbalah. Because after 1492, the focus of the study of Kabbalah was no longer primarily on creation and restoring the perfection of the world what it once was. Now the focus was, how do we hasten the arrival of the Messianic age? We know it's coming. We know that 1492 is this moment that signals that it's nearer rather than farther away. How do we bring it? You know, in Jewish terms, this is called dechikat haketz, pressing toward the end, forcing the pace of history. So there was this new Kabbalah, or new orientation in Kabbalah, which was more messianic in nature. Now, one of the places Sholem said it happened more than anywhere else, one of the places we really see it was a town in the land of Israel, which was populated largely by Jewish refugees of Spain, which became a center of Kabbalah study. Probably after 1492, well, one of the top 3 Kabbalah centers in the world, and this was the city of Tzfat, Tzfat. You know, up in the Galilee, up in the mountains. It's very mystical. Today it's all artists and mystics. It's just, what can I say? It's full of weirdos of various kinds. But the Kabbalists of Spain, and especially one whose name was Isaac Luria, known as the Ari, he was the dean, so to speak, of this new school of Kabbalah. Now that shift, that growing preoccupation with the Messianic age, that wasn't happening without 1492. Assuming Sholem is right, I should be honest with you, one of Sholem's disciples challenged that thesis, and it's been a matter of debate in the academic Jewish history world for a few decades now. But it's a compelling argument. But the argument it wasn't just about the emergence of a new kind of Kabbalah, because one of the consequences of that new Kabbalah and this larger preoccupation with the Messianic age is an event. You know, this new Kabbalah school in Tzfat started in the 1570s, and less than a century later, in the 1660s, we have the emergence of an individual named Shabbatai Tzvi, who, like David Reuveni and Shlomo Molcho and others, claimed to be the Mashiach. But he was the first to claim to be the Mashiach when the new ideas of what's known as Lurianic Kabbalah, Messianic-oriented Kabbalah, or Kabbalah that believes that the Messianic age is coming soon, when Shabbatai Tzvi appears as the Mashiach, claims to be the Mashiach in the 1660s, or at least his main disciple claimed that he was, something really weird happened. Because typically, when an individual would claim to be the Mashiach, his following would usually be very local and would be brief. It wouldn't last very long. But the most important thing is usually, the people in the town, maybe the area, a few towns would believe, and then it would dissipate and disappear. But when Shabbatai Tzvi announced himself as the Mashiach in the 1660s, most of the Jewish world believed it. It was the first time that there was a messianic movement or a messianic claimant. A Jew was the first time, well, really since ancient times, where a Jew had claimed to be the Mashiach and had a massive following that extended over multiple continents. And the reason for that was because, at least what Sholem said, was that Jews in Europe and in the Middle East and in North Africa, all over, Jews were just saturated with this preoccupation about the Messianic age. So if Sholem is right, and 1492 did have this impact, the whole thing with Shabbatai Tzvi, really, it only happens because of the expulsion. Now there's one last part of it, because eventually this new Kabbalah would have an impact not only in Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, but this is finally where even Polish Jews would feel the effects, indirectly maybe, of the expulsion from Spain. So if we say expulsion from Spain, and then the emergence, this new preoccupation with the Mashiach, and this new Kabbalah, and Shabtai Tzvi, in Poland in the 1740s, there's a new movement in Judaism. There's a movement of spiritual revival that is using this new Kabbalah as a way to infuse Polish Jewry with a new sense of spirituality. That's a very, that's a very succinct way of describing a new kind of Judaism called Hasidic Judaism. Now, all of these things, the growing preoccupation with the Mashiach, the new Kabbalah, Shabtai Tzvi, Hasidic Judaism, according to the Sholem thesis, none of that happens without 1492. So where does that leave us ultimately? In some ways, some things would have happened. We would have this vibrant Sephardic diaspora. We would have the decline of Spain. But what we probably wouldn't have, we wouldn't have this new kind of Kabbalah, and maybe we don't have Hasidic Judaism without the expulsion from Spain. What that tells us is that this is an event that really had a powerful impact. But its impact wasn't only immediate, its impact was long-standing, but also its eventual impact, beyond its direct impact, its indirect impact could extend not just from Spain and its neighboring countries, but in many ways across the Jewish world. The expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492 was an event that ultimately would ripple for miles. Without it, yes, some things would happen. But without it, at the very least, we might be without Hasidim today. Toda Rabbah. Thank you very much. Okay, we got some questions. Bob's got one ready.
Back in Spain,
Yeah.
when they tried to convert all these Jews to Christianity,
Yeah.
probably a large percentage of those Jews said we're Christians, but they were praying as Jews, and they were doing it under the where they weren't seen. You know, they were praying as Jews, but under the where they couldn't find them.
You're talking about secret Jews. Well, let me first explain. The question was that what Bob was mentioning is that there were Jews that they were pretending to be Christians, but maybe they were praying in secret. What I would emphasize is, being a secret Jew in Spain was not easy. If you live in a country which is overwhelmingly Catholic, especially when rank and file Catholics are being told to look out for Christians being insincere, finding a place to pray was very difficult, okay? Because if you were spotted, if you did anything unusual, it was very difficult. In fact, really there were two things that secret Jews were able to do most effectively without getting caught. One was to study the Bible. You could study the Torah because Christians studied the Hebrew Bible too. You could teach your kids the Torah. The other thing was, I don't know how to put it, the feeling of being Jewish in your heart was something that was concealable. The belief that you're Jewish because the Inquisition couldn't get inside your head. But beyond that, come on, having a secret Passover Seder? If one of your neighbors saw you, the Inquisition was knocking on the door. And I can't emphasize enough the fear of the Inquisition. Because if the Inquisition came for you, your life was over. And you weren't just being killed, you were being tortured. Incidentally, the Inquisition pioneered methods of torture that, they're just so creepy. So it's more difficult. Now, having said that, remarkably, there were crypto-Jews who were able to do it. In 1720 in Madrid, the Inquisition, which was still the Inquisition, they discovered not just one crypto-Jew, not just one family, they discovered a congregation of 25 crypto-Jewish families who somehow, all the way to 1720, were able to conceal what they were doing. I don't know how they did it. I mean, just imagine concealing the fact that you were a communist in the 1950s and doing that for 250 years, if there was like McCarthy for 250 years. What's that? Yeah, but that's more the exception. Typically, anything unusual, for example, you hear stories that Christians who were secretly Jews would turn the crucifixes around on Friday. That was sort of a converso, a secret Jewish thing to do. But if one of your Christian neighbors saw you doing that, they were reporting you, because you didn't want to be the Christian who didn't report the secret Jew to the Inquisition, because then you would get in trouble. It was a scary time. So it was difficult to do. Some Jews managed to do it, and they managed to perpetuate it for several generations. Yeah, question.
Well, my simplistic view of the expulsion before this was that they just hated Jews. They didn't like them.
Mm-hmm.
But you make me think that it's really more of a Christian identity crisis, that they were more worried about their religion and losing their religion. Is that
Absolutely. They had their deeply rooted Catholic reasons for not liking Jews, but they'd had those for 400 years and hadn't kicked out the Jews. There was this, one of the reasons why Christians were becoming less tolerant is they were worried, they're insecure. And so, the same time they're driving Jews out of Spain, they're also driving Muslims out of Spain. It's no coincidence that the long-standing battle between Christians and Muslims in Spain. The version of the Crusade in Spain wasn't called the Crusade; it was called the Reconquista, the reconquest of Spain by Christians. As long as Christians were actively reconquering Spain from Muslims, the situation of Jews was good because they were needed. And once most of Spain was conquered by Christians, which was about 1250, everything except Granada in the south, the situation of Jews begins to decline. And it's more than just a coincidence that the decision to expel Jews accompanies the moment when the last of the Muslims, the Moors, were driven out of Spain. There was this notion that for Christianity to thrive, it has to be only Christian. If anyone else is around, like you say, it's going to undermine the pure Christian feeling. That's a novel thing. Christians didn't always believe that. But yeah, in Spain, they were becoming less and less tolerant because in many ways they were less and less secure about the ability of Christianity, its ideas, not only to triumph, to be the best religion around, but to hold on to its own adherents. They were worried that they were going to lose people, and they didn't want these temptations around. Good question. Yeah. Yeah.
They were persecuted, I guess. I mean, were there Inquisition stuff going on?
Well, great question. What about crypto-Jews who went to the Spanish colonies in the New World, for example? There was a branch of the Inquisition in the New World. There were definitely crypto-Jews there. The one advantage that crypto-Jews had in the New World is it was a really large territory, and there were fewer officials. The Inquisition in, let's say, in South America, there was really just one for all Spanish colonies. So there was a staffing problem in terms of hunting down heresy. They didn't have that many, whereas in Europe, the ratio would be a lot larger. So if you were a crypto-Jew, and there definitely were crypto-Jews who came to the New World, maybe, there's a lot of speculation that some came with Columbus. Such a great story. No proof of that whatsoever, even though... Columbus was a Jew, Columbus was a crypto-Jew. No, none of that. There's nothing to any of that. But there were crypto-Jews in the New World. If you could get settled and elude the Inquisition, for those crucial first weeks, like get a place to live. And if you made it for the first weeks, months, you were probably okay in the long term, especially if you lived somewhere that was a distance from Inquisition headquarters. You definitely didn't want to live in a place where the Inquisition was headquartered because it was simply too easy to get caught. Okay, and there were crypto-Jews who lasted a long time. Many of them eventually simply became Christians.
I read that they had some crypto Jews in the Philippines, and they had to ship them to Mexico because that was the closest
Right.
authority.
Everywhere, everything that was part of Spain, some of the people who went there were crypto-Jews, certainly. Yeah.
This is a little off the mark, but at the same time, when England went anti-Catholic,
Yes.
kicked them out,
Yes.
and they had a high to praise Catholics, and they persecuted them to this day.
Was the persecution of Catholics by Protestants or Protestants? Oh, the question was the persecution of Catholics by Protestants or Protestants by Catholics as bad as the persecution of Jews by Catholics or Protestants? I'm going to say it was probably worse because, Catholics and Protestants, they had their reasons for not liking Jews, the devil and all that. But Catholics and Protestants, when they looked at each other, they each believed not that the other was wrong, not just that they were wrong and sinful, but they were misleading. They were more of a threat to Christians than someone who wasn't Christian. In the same way, they saw conversos as a greater threat than Jews. In Spain, in other Christian countries, Catholics and Protestants saw each other as a greater threat than either saw Jews as a threat. And in England, it's also very interesting that when Catholics and Protestants in England finally settled their differences, that's the moment when Jews are welcomed back in, because there is this kind of religious neutrality or mutual toleration between Catholics and Protestants, which eventually becomes a toleration of Jews too. In England, and then in the Netherlands, and then eventually in France. That's really a big part of the modern Jewish history story. The emergence of a religiously tolerant society is always better for Jews. No, not surprising. Yeah, what's that? Oh, Doña Gracia. Doña Gracia Nasi. She was a woman who was born from Spain, who left Spain and went to Italy. She was like, Doña means a lady, like a noble. So she was part of the Jewish elite of Spain. She really was the leader of her community, first in Spain. I mean, look, she was a woman, so she wasn't the official leader, but unofficially she was the leader. And then when she went to Italy, she was the leader there as well. So she's a prominent Jewish woman who left Spain for Italy, for northern Italy, following the expulsion. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering, what do historians think about the three individuals who claim to be the Messiah? Did they really believe they were the Messiah, or were they running some kind of fraud game for either money?
Oh, the assumption about David Reuven. Oh, the question is, what about these Jews who claim to be the Messiah? David Reuveni, Shlomo Malchus, Shabbatai Tzvi. As best we can tell, they really believed they were the Mashiach. David Reuveni, he left a diary, which probably was written by him, so he definitely was. Molcho, yes, as best as we can tell. We don't have a lot of sources, so yes, they really did. And Shabbatai Tzvi, he never really, all we know about him is through his disciples, who claim that he really did. But yes, they really, really did believe that they were. They had that mission, I'm going to save the Jewish world. It just didn't turn out that way. They had the great ideas. If you don't actually produce results, that little movement fizzles. Yeah.
What happened to the crypto Jews at 17?
Oh, the ones that were discovered by the Inquisition? Exactly what you would expect. They were persecuted and executed as heretics by the Inquisition. I mean, if it makes any difference, they weren't persecuted any more than if they'd been caught in year number 1. They managed to do it for 250 years, and the penalty was no worse than doing it for one. But no, they were caught. We only know about them because the Inquisition caught them and described in great detail how they were arrested, tortured, and killed. But really, what's interesting about them is the fact that they were still there. The Inquisition was trying to stomp out converso heresy, and even in 1720, they weren't able to do it. It was a real embarrassment to the Inquisition. Well, if there are no other questions, is there one more question here? I'm sorry.
Any idea of how many died?
How many?
Were
Oh, how many died? You know, there's how many of the crypto Jews who were arrested and how many were killed by the Inquisition? There's a debate among historians. It depends what sources you use. If you go according to the sources of the Inquisition, who kept meticulous records of everything they did, the number is very high. They claimed they were finding conversos. It looks like they were inflating their figures a little bit. Other historians think the number is a little bit lower. An exact figure, it's probably in the tens of thousands. I mean, it wasn't nobody, but whether it was, you know, the Inquisition claimed it was like 100,000. It's probably 20,000, which is a significant number. I mean, they really were doing this. They were catching. They were catching people. The biggest problem is if you caught someone and got a confession, because the confession was coerced, it's difficult to know if it was real or they just wanted the pain to end. There's really no way to know. So how many actual crypto Jews were there? It's really hard to know. Depends who you ask. Yeah.
Wasn't there some also associated with that appropriation of their property and their funds and things like that? So there was a financial gain from doing this?
Oh yeah, if you were convicted of being a heretic, you know, either the church or the state got your property. So the incentive for catching someone was primarily theological, but it was not entirely theological. There definitely was a payoff. It wasn't like the families of the Jews got or the conversos got to inherit. No. You forfeited everything, and the state, it would go to the treasury. That's always the word. You know, it would go to the royal treasury, which means various government offices would fight over it. One last question, Norm. Go ahead.
You mentioned that there was been a spread of tolerance
Right.
afterwards, and the last country you mentioned was France.
Yes.
I don't think it's got there yet.
What's that?
I don't think it's got there yet.
You don't think it's got there yet?
The tolerance hasn't got there.
Well, it got to France for a while. It's just started retreating. You know. Without overgeneralizing, French people can be very schizophrenic about a lot of things. So they've always had this strong current of toleration, but they've always had this strong current of intolerance. One thing they're very good at doing as a society is being tolerant and intolerant at the same time. Remember, a big part of France was intolerant of Dreyfus, but even a larger part of France defended him. France has always been very divided and schizophrenic about things like tolerance. All right, we'll conclude this series next week. Thank you, everybody.